you let me know when the online folks are ready? Oh, I got a thumbs up. Okay.
Is the mic okay?
And is Heather's mic working?
Okay,
Or
perfect.
thumbs up. All right, very promising. Welcome, everyone, to this week's seminar speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Ford. Heather is a visiting scientist here at MLML while she is on sabbatical from Queen Mary University of London. Heather and I know each other from graduate school. We have the same PhD advisor, which means that we are academic siblings. Although we did not overlap, but we basically were like, we're perpetual conference buddies, so we always go to conferences together. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Heather before she starts. So in terms of her education, she got an undergraduate degree at UC Davis and then got a master's degree from San Diego State. So for the students, she, has been in your shoes. And then after that, she went to UC Santa Cruz for her PhD. After her PhD, she did a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And after that, she went to the University of Cambridge as an independent research fellow. And after that, she went to Queen Mary University of London. Let's see, she has many, many papers published, and many of them are in really high impact journals: Nature Science, Nature Geoscience, GRL, Nature Communications, Paleoceanography. These are all really high impact journals. She also serves as the editor of a journal called Climate of the Past. And at Queen Mary, she is director of the Physical Geography and Environmental Science Education Program, so doing teaching and research. She's also really active in the paleoceanography community, so there's a really wide community looking at periods of global warmth, and there's a group that she helps to coordinate called the Pliovar. I don't know if she's going to talk about that today. But anyway, so when I think about Heather, I think of her as a paleoceanographer, so that's, have some similarities there where she's looking at microfossils to reconstruct climate of the past. But really, I think more of Heather as a climate scientist, and she asks really important questions about how the Earth's climate system works and uses past climate as a way to learn about potential future climates.
So always really awkward when somebody introduces you, but thank you for that nice introduction. So I am a paleoceanographer and a climate scientist, and so you've probably had to suffer through some paleoceanography talks, and there's lots of little squiggly lines, and you can't quite figure out what's going to go, but I'm going to try and minimize that in this talk. But what I'm going to be talking about is essentially what is the ocean's capacity to store the heat in a climate system, in the heat that we've contributed with current climate change and future climate change. What is the ocean's role in kind of how we think about how it stores and moves around heat? And so I'm going to be I have a real problem with pointers. So why is this important? Well, actually the amount of climate change that we've already committed to human activities, to the amount of CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere, a lot of that is actually being absorbed by the ocean. The ocean's absorbing over 90% of the heat that we've already emitted due to the burning of fossil fuels. So some of it is related to just melting ice or the atmosphere, but a lot of that heat is actually going into the ocean and being stored in the ocean. So if we look at how ocean heat content has changed over the last 50, 70 years, you can see that the amount of heat that the ocean is storing in the upper 700 meters has increased markedly, especially kind of around the 1980s and so on. And it will continue to rise, right? Because the ocean is accommodating a lot of the heat due to current climate change and the CO2 emissions that we have. But kind of the big question is, what is the ocean's long-term capacity to store this heat? Is it going to continue absorbing a lot of the heat that we're putting in due to global emissions, or is there some capacity that it has to do this heat? And so what I do as a paleoceanographer or a climate scientist is I'm really interested in looking at how past climates can inform our understanding of future climate change. Basically, a big tenet, I think, of for paleoceanography or paleoclimatologists is how do we use the past to inform our future? And so these are just some, one of the things that I'm really involved in is a lot of the data model comparison that goes into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC reports. So using those same class of models that are used to predict future climate change, what's their ability to hindcast periods of global warmth or different climates that we have. So there's a couple different kind of states that we look at in paleoceanography or paleoclimatology. One is the Mid-Cretaceous, which is about 95 million years ago, time of the dinosaurs. The early Eocene, this is 55 million years ago. This is when we had a huge explosion of mammals, bats, all those kind of clades expanded and diversified during this time. And then we have the Pliocene, which is this time period about 3 million years ago. And then we have the last glacial maximum, which is about 20,000 years ago. The last glacial maximum had a lot of ice. CO2 was lower. But again, it provides us kind of a boundary condition of like, what climate states can we hindcast? And so what I'm going to focus on is this period called the Pliocene. It's a time period about 3 million years ago. We know that CO2 is estimated to be about where it is today. It's about 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. Global climate is about 2 to 3 degrees warmer in its mean state. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Pliocene, which is encapsulated in this artist's reconstruction, if you go up to the Canadian high Arctic, to Ellesmere Island, frozen tundra, nothing there. But they actually find camel fossils up in this area at this time. So we know that this climate must have been so different globally in order to sustain these huge, vegetation eaters, right? It must have been so much different during this time period. So if we use the Pliocene or any of these other climate states, how do we use a comparison in terms of what our future scenarios look like? So you have your worst case scenario, 585, best case scenario, 126, and how do we see commonality between our past climates and our future climates? So what I'm going to be talking about today is the tropical climate conditions that we have. And so the tropical climate has a really big outsized impact on global climate. And many of you are probably familiar with El Nino Southern Oscillation, right? It's an event that happens every 2 to 7 years, but it has huge impacts on global climate in terms of variability. And so if we just look at the tropical Pacific in its mean climate state, there's a couple things that we see. We see that the Western Pacific over by Indonesia is really warm. We see that the Eastern Pacific, where we have the Galapagos, is really cold. And so we have a really strong zonal sea surface temperature gradient here. The other thing that we see is that the thermocline, that's the area where temperature rapidly decreases with depth, is really shallow in the Eastern Pacific and much deeper in the Western Pacific. And if we, just to emphasize, we have a strong zonal temperature gradient. And if we look at something like an El Nino, which happens like every 2 to 7 years, basically a lot of those conditions go away, right? We get this warming in the Eastern Pacific. Our thermocline deepens in the Eastern Pacific, and the atmospheric circulation patterns change as well. But the main physical thing that we see is that we see this weak zonal sea surface temperature gradient and this deepening of this thermocline. So if we look at how also El Nino, or the tropical conditions, play into our overall global climate, when we have these big El Nino events, that's basically when we get a large jump in global temperatures as well. El Nino causes a lot of heat to escape into the global climate system. We get a lot of warming. So that just sort of speaks to how important tropical conditions are to our global patterns. So I'm a paleoceanographer, like Petra said. I work on ocean cores. One of the things that you can find in these ocean cores are these little these little protists called foraminifera. They're about the size of a single grain of sand. You can analyze the chemistry of these forams. So I'm interested in either the stable isotopes or the minor elements. And you can analyze them on various instruments. But that's basically my workflow if I'm looking at just data. And so the great thing about these little protists is, like, most animals, they have their own particular ecological niches. And you can use their depth distribution to reconstruct different parts of the water column. So there's some forams, ruber and ciculifer, that they actually have photosynthetic algae that hang out with them. Zooxanthellae, no, not zooxanthellae, that's corals. But they have this symbiotic relationship with photosymbionts, so they have to be in the photic zone. They have to be relatively shallow. And then you have a couple other species that a little bit further, Deutetrae, and P.O. Blick. And so they have this depth distribution in the foraminiferous. So we can use this information to help us reconstruct different parts of the water column. And this is just work by one of my colleagues, Karim Lakhani. And so if we look at how the tropical Pacific has changed over the last 5 million years, it looks a lot different. So these are two records. The next two slides, I think, are the only squiggly line slides that I have. So these are two records. One's over here in red from the Western Pacific here. And what you can see from this temperature record, this is from 0 to 5 million years ago. The red line basically kind of stays about the same. There's no real warming or cooling in the Western Pacific. But if we look at the Eastern Pacific, we can see that today the temperatures are really cool in the Eastern Pacific. But if we go back in time, we can see that the Eastern Pacific is much warmer 5 million years ago, 3 million years ago than it is today. So if we look at the zonal temperature gradient across this time period, we can see we have a temperature gradient of about 6 degrees, and it goes down to maybe 1, 2 degrees back into the Pliocene. And so this suggests that the mean state of the tropical Pacific is El Nino-like, at least in its surface characteristics. The other thing is that we can look at, we have this depth distributions from these foraminifera that live a little bit deeper in the water column. So we can look at how subsurface temperatures have changed over the last 5 million years. So there's a lot of squiggly lines here, but I'm going to point out two of them. So here's this orange record here in the Western Pacific. You can see that the subsurface temperatures are relatively cool, but when we go back 5 million years ago, they're much warmer, on the order of 5 degrees warmer. Same thing for the Eastern Pacific. If we go back, today they're 15, 13 degrees, but we go back even further, 4 or 5 million years ago, we're looking at 25 degrees centigrade in the subsurface of the Eastern Pacific. So this suggests that we've also had changes in the conditions of the thermocline itself, either that it's getting warmer or that it's getting deeper. And so because El Nino events refer to interannual variability that happens every 2 to 3 years, but really we're talking about the mean state here, we've started calling this time period 3 to 5 million years ago when we see this reduced zonal temperature gradient and we see this warming of the subsurface, we've started calling this El Padre, because we have this reduced sea surface temperature gradient and warm subsurface temperatures. So is the models that we use for simulating climate, how is their ability to reconstruct or to simulate those conditions that we see from the proxy records themselves? So how well do our current models actually reconstruct this change in the zonal sea surface temperature gradient and this warming in the subsurface? So one of the things that we see, there's a whole group of people that work on these climate models. There's over, at least for the Pliocene itself, if you look at modern models, you've got, I think, 60 some odd groups globally that are working on future projections. When you get into past climate models, there's fewer groups that are working on it, but you've got probably like 10, 12 different groups that are working on simulating this one period 3 million years ago. And so if we look at what's called the Pliocene Intermodel Comparison Project, all these different groups comparing their climate models' ability to simulate this climate, there's a couple things that they don't quite get right. So one of the things that they don't quite get right in the climate models is that they have a limited reduction in the sea surface temperature gradient across the Pacific. And the other thing that they don't quite get right is that the proxy data that we have for our paleo reconstructions shows that we have a lot of polar amplification. And the models that we have for the Pliocene, at least, don't show the same magnitude of warming that the data itself suggests. So there's two kind of limitations that we see from the paleo models today. So this kind of brings me to the work that I'm going to be discussing for the rest of the seminar, is how well does the models, when we zoom into just the tropical Pacific, how well do they capture this El Padre? How well do they capture this reduced zonal temperature gradient that we see and these changes, these warm subsurface temperatures? So there's a lot of known problems with just reconstructing the tropics today. One of the things that they do is that they have like a double ITCZ in the climate models. But we're not necessarily looking for an exact match between the models and the proxy data. And I like this quote. It's like, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. There's something that we're going to get out of these models that shows us the dynamics that are important for thinking about climate, modern climate, future climate, and past climate. So here I'm going to be showing you a bunch of records using a whole cast of characters from our little foraminifera. And these are the sites that I'm going to be looking at in the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific. And so we're going to harness this information that we have from the depth distributions to make up these reconstructions. So if we just take a slice across the tropical Pacific for the Pliocene period that we use to do our data model comparisons, so this is longitude on here. This is depth going from the surface of the ocean to about 800 meters. Again, this is the Western Pacific, this is the Eastern Pacific. And what I'm showing you here in the violin plots and the dots, this is the proxy data that we have available for this time period 3 million years ago. And there's also some estimates that have uncertainty here, but basically these are the violin plots represent the range of depths that these foraminifera can live in. And then you've got some surface indicators as well. But if we remember from what we have for the proxy data says that there's just a little bit of warming in the Western Pacific. There's a lot of warming in the Eastern Pacific at the surface, that reduced zonal temperature gradient, and we get a lot of warming in the subsurface, right? So that's what we're looking for when we look at our data and how we compare it to the other models. And so just as an example, here's one of the models that's participated in this modeling and comparison product. This is the Cosmos model. And so one of the things that we can see if we just look at the modeling output in the back, this model has a lot of warming in the Western Pacific, not a lot of warming in the Eastern Pacific, and not much subsurface warming at all. So in terms of matching the data in the sign and direction, the Cosmos model doesn't do a great job of matching the proxy data that we have. So it's too warm in the Western Pacific, and it doesn't get the rest of the field right. So it doesn't get that reduced zonal temperature gradient or that warm subsurface that we see from these violin plots. And also, I should say, like, a lot of this modeling work synthesis is done by a close collaborator of mine, Natalie Brawls. I'm just like learning how to manipulate climate modeling output myself. I'm much more of a lab person, so definitely rely on your colleagues to help you with new skill learning. So Natalie's been really great about that. And so if we look at the whole suite of models that we have for this data model comparison, there's kind of like 3 different flavors of model performance that we can see. We have some models, like the Cosmos model, that have a too warm Western Pacific and not enough warming in the subsurface. There's some models like this, I don't remember which that one, I think IPCA model. It basically kind of has a uniform warming. It doesn't have that spatial variability we expect. And there are some models that do have that asymmetric surface warming, so warming in the east, less warming in the west, and warm subsurface. So there are some models that do a reasonably good job of matching the proxy data that we have. And it's not to say that those other models don't have other skill in other areas. It's just for the tropical Pacific, they don't have a lot of skill. So again, we did a cluster analysis of these pliomet models, and they did fit into these about 3 different clusters. We have models that do too warm in the Western Pacific, but not enough warming in the east, and not enough warming in the subsurface. We have models that do kind of a uniform warming in the surface and the subsurface. And then we have models that do this asymmetric warming with more warming in the east and more warming in the subsurface. But one of the things that's really popular when you look at climate models is to do this thing called a multi-model mean. So you take all the models together and you average them. And when you do that, you see that a lot of the features that you want to capture in the proxy data are actually very muted when you look at the model mean. So it mutes this idea of this reduced zonal temperature gradient and the subsurface warming. So what's interesting about what happens in the subsurface of the tropical Pacific is that those waters are actually advected from elsewhere, right? So those waters are formed in kind of these mid-latitude regions in the North Pacific and the South Pacific. This is a measure of particle depth, so these red warmer colors means that they're close to the surface, and blue is that they're deep. So basically a little parcel of water sinks in these mid-latitude regions. It advects all the way over here and then gets entrained into the equator, and it eventually upwells in the eastern Pacific. So the water that you're seeing in the subsurface of the tropic is actually coming from about 20 to 30 degrees north or south. So that means that these areas must have been much different in the past than they are today. So if we look at the clusters of models that we have, what we can see is that the clusters that have that best fit with the proxy data from the tropics also show this warm mid-latitude, high-latitude warming. So that means like the water that's coming into the tropics is coming from those mid-latitude regions, and those areas have to be warm as well. And so if we think about how the tropics is linked to these mid-latitude to high-latitude regions, it turns out that there's basically a one-to-one relationship. So when you look at the zonal temperature gradient across the tropical Pacific and the meridional temperature gradient from the equator up into high latitudes, you can see that there's basically a one-to-one relationship over this time. When the high latitudes are warm, the subsurface in the tropics is warm. When the high latitudes cool, you start to see that cooling in the subsurface as well. So all of these things are kind of climatically linked. So how does that get us back to thinking about heat content, right? I started this whole talk with thinking about heat content. Well, this shows that these warm subsurface temperatures that we're getting in the tropical Pacific, that the ocean heat content was much, much higher in this Pliocene warm period, and much higher than today. And this has broader implications for how we think about the ocean's capacity to store this heat and kind of the knock-on effects that we're likely to have. So ocean heat content is related to hurricane strength and storm intensity. The thermal expansion of water, so sea level will also increase. You get marine heat waves, so that big blob off California that happened a few years ago. And it also is related to the ocean heat content, right? Warm water doesn't hold as much oxygen. And that's really important for thinking about any kind of ecological interaction, respiration rates, chemical reactions, huge implications for thinking about ocean heat content. And so I have a student, Harry, who's working on synthesizing the plio models and directly comparing them to the SSP scenarios that are included in the IPCC. And I won't go through all of this, but basically what the color bar is that if you see blues, that means that the Pliocene was colder in that particular area, and if it's red, it was warmer in that particular area. But this is a comparison of the ocean heat content from the upper 700 meters for the Pliocene minus the scenario. And it's actually the end of century here, SSP 585, that is most similar to the heat content estimates that we have for the Pliocene, but the Pliocene is still 20% larger when you're just looking at the models, right? And we know that the models don't necessarily get the same magnitude or direction of ocean heat content that we see from the proxy data. So actually the Pliocene's ability to store heat is much higher than what we're seeing for worst case scenario end of century. I don't know what that means in the long term, but yeah, I don't know what that means, but it is much, much larger than we were expecting for worst case scenario end of century. So, just to summarize, one of the things that we see from the Pliocene tropical Pacific is that the subsurface temperatures that we see are poorly captured by most models. We also see that the models that do have a good fit with the subsurface warming that we see from the proxy data also have more enhanced mid to high latitude warming. So they see this polar amplification that's poorly captured in most models. We see that the Mid-Pliocene had a high ocean heat content, and it's something to consider besides just thinking about the sea surface temperature field. And then the Mid-Pliocene heat content is also much higher than the SSP scenarios that we see for future climate change. So I wanted to talk a little briefly about what I'm going to be doing for my sabbatical at Moss Landing. One of the things that I'm really interested in is this idea of ocean heat content. And so one of the things that we're seeing today, right now, is a really big expansion with the Indo-Pacific warm pool. What did that look like 3 million years ago? Petra actually generated some records that I'm looking at in the Indian Ocean here to try and get at the spatial extent and kind of depth of the Indo-Pacific warm pool. And so those are some of the records that I've been looking at. This is our lab group at a pig roast like a week ago. This is our PhD supervisor, Christina Ravello, and some of the graduate students that came through her lab in the last 20 years. So that's what I've been working on, this idea of what is the Indo-Pacific warm pool doing, because the Indo-Pacific warm pool itself also has huge impacts on the distribution of precipitation, including monsoons. So knowing what that looks like is really important for thinking about social stability and that kind of thing, precipitation distribution. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is that probably what you've noticed from if you've ever sat through any paleo talk is that basically you're representing really fundamental dynamical processes by like one site. So we have really poor spatial resolution. But one of the things that's becoming increasingly common in the kind of work that I do is using data assimilation techniques. So basically using the climate models that can capture these dynamical processes, compare them to the data that you have that's really poor spatially, but use them to inform each other so that you can reconstruct the entire field. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing is that, okay, the climate models don't necessarily get the same magnitude of subsurface warming that we see in terms of these ocean heat content estimates, but can we get a better handle of this using data assimilation? So, no, this isn't what I want. What do I want? Oh, okay, no, this is what I want. Okay, so I'm actually only gonna be here for like another 2 weeks or so because I had to change my my travel plans because of the Nerd Reich doing all kinds of things to the federal agencies. But, you know, sort of the mantra of what I see as the mantra of the field is that we study the past to understand the future. So the kinds of questions that I'm interested in is thinking about warm climates, thinking about ocean circulation, deep ocean circulation, and thinking about ice sheet decay and growth. So I'm only going to be here for probably another 2 weeks, but if you want to come and talk to me about any of those things, please do. I'm in Kenneth Gold's old office on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then I think the other thing that's really important to think about is that it's been wild being on sabbatical over the last 2 months while the US government's been asset stripped. So, you know, I'm actually registered in the state of Minnesota in a pretty rural place, so his interns get to hear from me like a couple times a week at this point, complaining about things. Very polite to them. They're little babies. They don't, yeah, they're just be polite to your interns. But then there's also little acts of resistance that, you know, I've been doing for a while. So one of the things that I've done, and you can see also, there's Petra, is thinking about like how do we create equitable communities, and how do we use data, or just like how do we make the society that we want? And some of it has been truth telling and doing this data analysis that shows that we have big problems when we think about our communities and what representation looks like. So I think one of the things I want to say is also just like, I'm an elder millennial. I don't know how many of you have watched Mr. Rogers, but especially during these times, is like, look for the helpers, because they are still there. And really think about the community that you're engaging with and building, because they're going to get you through this long winter. So with that, I will end my talk. So if anybody has any questions about any of the squiggly lines, I'm happy to answer them.
My job is to pass around the microphone to people who have questions so that the online people can hear. Questions? I was like looking at Ivano. Come on, Ivano.
Talking about ice.
Ice,
Yeah.
okay.
Actually, one of the people in the picture is Michelle Drake, which is a graduate
Oh,
from
yeah.
West Landing. Right, was in my lab. So we have a long tradition here. So the question was about the difference that between the Pliocene, say the 3 million years old Pliocene and the predicted scenarios for ocean heat content in the future. How does the fact that the North Hemisphere ice cap wasn't present back then affect that? How much does it play into that difference between the Pliocene and the future scenario?
That's a really great question. I think that is some of the things that we're seeing. I think that's part of what we're seeing here in terms of the spatial difference that we're seeing between the SSP scenario. No, I know, I went through it really quickly. Okay, no, it's okay. So what this slide is it's just looking at the upper ocean heat content in the upper 700 meters, and it's looking at an anomaly between what's modeled for the Pliocene versus what's modeled for the SSPs. So it's basically Pliocene minus the scenario.
So
and
does that mean when it is red, the Pliocene is warmer than
Yes.
the model shows? And
Yes.
blue, okay.
Yeah, so
That's
it is the Pliocene model minus the SSP scenario. And the different layers are, the top layer is just 2100 to 2040, the middle layer is 2140 to 2060, excuse me, and then the bottom layer is 2081 to 2100, so end of century. And so that's what's implied there, is that you're continuing to emit CO2 or not emit as much CO2. Yes, so the red ones mean that the Pliocene. Okay. Yeah, so red means like the Pliocene was warmer entirely. And so even though there's a lot of spatial variability here, so the Atlantic is much cooler here, and the Pacific is much warmer here, in the mean, the Pliocene still has a larger ocean heat content than the SSP scenario. And part of that is because the SSP scenario probably isn't in equilibrium versus the Pliocene climate is and has something like a smaller ice sheet. I'm going to guess part of the reason that the Atlantic is cooler is because that's related to Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. But I haven't investigated it further than that. Well, Panama's closed at this point.
Structure. No, I'm done.
Yeah, so Panama's closed at this point. It's closed at about 4 million years. So the modeling is from 3, so Panama's closed, yeah. But yeah, so there's part of the differences are going to be something that's like this is kind of an emerging thing, like the pattern effect, so how much of it is just related to just CO2 being larger versus what the different boundary conditions are, like Panama. Although Panama's not for the Pliocene, but like those kinds of boundary conditions, the ice sheet, those are things that will have a direct impact on the climate state independent of CO2, right? We know that there's a strong relationship between CO2 and climate. But what are those other things that might be influencing climate, those other boundary conditions?
Are there questions? I wonder if you could maybe give your pitch for what you mean by the Pliocene is probably in equilibrium, whereas we're currently not in equilibrium, just for the benefit of the
Oh, okay.
students.
So what do I mean by equilibrium? So by equilibrium, I mean like the sinks are in, like not in phase, but like the sinks and the sources are kind of like balanced out, right? Versus our SSPs are CO2 moving forward. It's not. It's in a transient climate state. So the sinks and the sources aren't stabilized at that point. So that's what the transient versus equilibrium means. Yeah.
Thank you, and I'm sorry if you did talk about this. I came in quite late, but because we're looking at the upper 700 meters, I'm curious what you might hypothesize this would look like for the bottom of the ocean. I mean, I'm looking at like Labrador Sea area. It's warmer than Pliocene there. I mean, do you think that this model would project then some of that downwelling?
So the issue, so two things. One, ocean circulation was probably really different during the Pliocene. So there's evidence that we had a Pliocene, like in the North Pacific, we had Pliocene North Pacific deep water formation, which changes that energy balance and carbon storage in the Pacific. And our North Atlantic deep water was probably, I'm gonna say it's weaker, but that's controversial. I mean, the ideas of what deep ocean circulation was doing during the Pliocene is still very much like in progress. So one is going to be what is even the configuration of those deep water masses, and then two, I can tell you that the water in the Atlantic was at depth was much warmer than it was even in the Pacific. So there's some spatial heterogeneity there, and you don't see kind of those basins kind of connect and talk to each other in a temperature way until after northern hemisphere glaciation. So you have to build big ice sheets before you start to see a lot of temperature communication between those two basins.
Thank you, great talk. So if you go back to the slide where you have comparisons between different models,
Yeah.
like the one with a lot, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm kind of wondering, like, how do you read those plots? Because I'm a bit confused. Because so if you look at the third column and second row, that one looks pretty nice to me. Like it fits pretty well to me. I don't know.
This
But
one
I might
here?
be reading it wrong.
This one?
Yeah.
The Leeds model? Yeah, it's one of the models that does a reasonably good job of matching the proxy data. So some of the models do a reasonably good job of matching kind of that. We don't want to see a lot of warming in the Western Pacific. We want to see more warming in the Eastern Pacific, and we want to see subsurface warming. So some of the models do a good job of it. Some of them don't do a very good job of it. Like some of them are, like the Cosmos model is really warm at the surface. Some of them don't have a lot of warming at all. Some of them actually show cooling. So it's kind of, not all the models have good fit with the data here, but some of them do.
Right. And so do you end up picking the ones that work really well, or do you use the mean, as you said earlier, like it kind of dilutes or mutes certain features that you want to see? So what do you end up choosing?
So what we did is we clustered them based on their performance. So we used some statistical analyses to cluster them. So they did fall into these three kinds of clusters, where some of them, did do, got the two warming in the Western Pacific, or the uniform warming, or the features that we're seeing. So that, they had that. And then, yeah, the multi-model mean really mutes the features. But I guess I didn't make this very clear, but so the models that have the pattern that we're expecting, those are the same models. Can I go forward? Okay. Those are oh no, I don't want to do that. Don't want to do an update. Okay, so those are the same models that are showing this connection to the mid-latitudes, right? So that same cluster that does a good job of matching that spatial field, those are the ones that are getting warm waters in the mid-latitudes that are then coming down. So that's the dynamical connection, That's the dynamical connection that those models get right to show that pattern in the tropical Pacific. And these models they don't have that mid to high latitude warming, so they're not getting that connection, that dynamical connection right.
I have a related question. So if those models, so you talked about how El Nino has this sort of outsized impact on global climate. So if you take, and these are like a subset of models that are used to doing model forecasts.
Yeah.
So if these models that do a reasonably good job at hindcasting the
Yeah.
Pliocene, what do their future scenarios look like? Are they significantly different from the other models?
I haven't gotten that far and dug into the specific models. What I can tell you about the model performance in general for the class of models that's included for future climate is that the models that are doing the future forecast, most 50-ish% of them are moving towards a more El Nino-like state, so they're getting a reduced zonal temperature gradient, but the variance, the variability, so ENSO variability, there's no consensus in terms of what that looks like. So that half of them are saying that the mean state's gonna go more El Nino-like, so that reduced zonal temperature gradient, but the variability, ENSO, no idea. No consensus among the models.
But do those models also predict overall, like globally, or is their overall projection for average global warmth higher because they have
I have to look into it. Yeah, I don't know.
Thanks. Any other questions? Oh, one more.
Question. I'm just curious. So as you look down the core, so it transitioned through time, but the past, right? And so, can you see? Do you see like changes in terms of like the rates at which these temperature changes, or is it like like as it tips from one end to the other end, it just proceeds really quickly and
That's a really good question. So this is just the subsurface temperature records. So this is the Western Pacific here, the orange, and then these are just a collection of cores that we have from the Eastern Pacific itself. So some of these are in the warm pool, Eastern Pacific warm pool, some of them are in the core, the cold tongue. And so one of the things that we see is that all of the Eastern Pacific cores have this really rapid change from about 5 to 4 million years ago, and that's what we think is closure of the Isthmus of Panama, because that would be the expected signal. And then we kind of see this like monotonic cooling from 4 to today. And that's also when we start to see a really strong connection between we see like a 1-to-1 change between the surface temperatures and the subsurface temperatures happens after about 4 million years ago. The Eastern Pacific and this subsurface, that's basically, the Eastern Pacific sea surface temperatures are connected to the subsurface via upwelling. So that's when we start to see a 1-to-1 cooling between the surface and the subsurface, so that dynamical connection.
Whole conversation about proxies. Only you? I can say. You saved us from the other part of the story, which is, we're using proxies here, right?
Yeah.
Nobody went back on time. I mean, I did once, and then I came back and measured directly the temperatures. So this is all proxies.
Yeah.
And there's also disagreement between different types of proxies, especially when it comes to CO2, right? There's but even temperature, so whether it's alkenones or magnesium.
Yeah, I sort of skipped over a lot of the nuance of it.
Right.
Yeah.
But thank you for doing it.
Yeah.
Because that would have taken. But no, that's important to always remember that those are estimates, and they're incredible things. By the way, just amazing how nature gives us this clue about past physical conditions. But we really don't know. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
I will just say that on the Eastern Pacific, there are multiple proxies, and I think the Eastern Pacific we're probably more confident in. There's probably a little bit more controversy around the Western Pacific for the surface, but there are. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. We literally could have like several hour conversations.
Yeah, we could.
Like,
Alkanones max out. Tex 86 is trash. So you just have magnesium, calcium. Well, the reason I say that is Tex 86 is influenced by subsurface temperatures, right? So if you get big changes in subsurface temperatures, like are demonstrated here, it's going to influence the Tex proxy, and you can't just use that as a surface indicator. So it has utility, just not as a sea surface temperature indicator.
Okay.
Shots
Any
fired.
last questions?